In this video, I'll show you how to create a metahuman, animate them in Maya, and render a cinematic with that character in Unreal Engine 4. I won't assume you know anything more than basic 3D animation, but there's a lot to cover and this video is already long enough, so I'll mention additional resources that go in-depth into topics I don't. The first thing you'll need is Unreal Engine 4. I provided a link in the description, but I should mention this is going to be a large download, so give yourself plenty of time and bandwidth. I've also provided a link for Advanced Skeleton 5, a Maya rigging tool that we'll use to create the animation controls for our metahuman. You can get the LiveLink Face app for iOS if you don't want to animate faces by hand and happen to have an iPhone with a true depth camera. You'll still need Advanced Skeleton to animate the body, but this is an option for the face. What's not optional is Quixel Bridge, which you'll need to create and manage your metahumans. Bridge is mainly an asset library of high-res 3D scanned objects and textures for use with Unreal, but it's also the pipeline between Metahuman Creator, Maya, and Unreal. There's a link to Quixel Bridge in the description as well. You'll also need Maya 2020. At the time of recording this video, Maya 2022 doesn't work well with metahumans, so I'll be using the 2020 version instead. Quixel and Epic are actively working on fixing the latest version, and once they do, the process should be exactly the same as I'm showing you here. You'll need to set up Maya in a very particular way, so go into your settings, scroll down to settings, and make sure that the up axis is set to Z, and that you have linear centimeters and angular degrees. The other settings you can leave at the defaults, but those are the ones that have to be changed to accommodate metahumans. On my shelf to the top left, you can see a few tools, but there's two that you'll probably want for what we're doing. The first is Studio Library. It's a free pose tool that will allow us to save tons of time on facial animation. The link is in the description. I'll go more into detail in a little bit, but basically it's a way to select a group of controls, pose them in a particular way, and then save that pose for later use. In this case, I save the particular mouth shapes for dialogue, and I can reapply those when I'm blocking out my first pass of dialogue. The other tool that I make heavy use of is Animbot. It's not free, but it's totally worth the cost for anyone serious about animation. It's not mandatory for what we're doing, but I feel like I'd be wrong not to mention it. The link for Animbot's website is in the description. To create our metahuman, we'll be using Quixel Bridge. Go to the Edit menu, click Manage Plugins, and make sure you have Unreal and the Maya plugins downloaded before we do anything else. If you forget to do this, Bridge will remind you when you try to export later on, but it's easier to do this part ahead of time. So, to make a metahuman, we can click on the Metahuman option on the left-hand side menu, and then just select any one of the preset characters. I have a few metahumans I've already created, and once you've made your first one, you'll get that option of My Metahumans. But for now, assuming you have never done this, just click one of the presets, and on the right-hand side menu, click Start MHC, that's Metahuman Creator. This will launch it in your default web browser. And if you've ever used a character creator before, or have played an RPG, Skyrim, something like that, this will feel really familiar. You basically just combine preset templates and blend them together, change options like hair, eyebrows, or even the skin texture, and you'll eventually get something close to what you want. It doesn't have the same kind of flexibility and fine-tune control as what you would expect from like a modern MMO, but considering that it's built using scans of actual people and it's trying to be physically accurate, it's sort of understandable that you can't really do anything you imagine. The clothing options in particular is kind of limited. Understandably so, it's early access and they are going to add more, but it's a fairly easy thing to create additional clothing if you need to using Marvelous Designer or what have you. Regardless, once you have a character you're happy with, go back to Bridge and click on your My Metahumans option, and then on the bottom right, you'll see an option for the texture resolution. I find 2K to be more than enough. Set that, then click download to begin downloading your Metahuman. Once there's a check mark on your Metahuman's thumbnail, you'll know you have it downloaded, and then you're ready to export. So you can click on the options, select the export target, and in this case we want it to be Maya because we want to bring this character into Maya. Make sure that you have Maya open in the background, and then click export. You'll see a message that pops up saying it's exporting to Maya. You have to remember at this point to tab over to Maya because there's actually a message box there waiting for you that says, "Hey, are you sure you really wanted to do what you told me?" Click yes, and it'll begin importing your Metahuman. Depending on your hardware, this process can take a while. It's importing a significant amount of texture information and building a fairly complicated rig. Eventually, you should see your Metahuman standing in the scene, minus the clothing and hair, which is not provided. It will have the facial control rig though, and that's mainly what we need. Now, if your Metahuman comes in with black skin or looks very weird, most likely it's an issue with your display settings, so just go into your settings and make sure that your viewport 2.0 is set to DirectX 11 and not OpenGL. So now that we have our Metahuman sitting in Maya, ready to go, click on the Advanced Skeleton shelf button to open it up. Make sure that you don't have anything extraneous in the hierarchy. We just want Metahuman as it came in from Bridge. So don't move it, don't modify it. Click on Name Matcher to open up the Name Matcher tool in Advanced Skeleton. And it should detect that this is a Metahuman in the scene, but if not, be sure to set it. The first thing we're going to do is click Create and place Fit Skeleton. Now I'll show the joints so you can see what it's doing. And I'll set those joints to be X-ray. So there. So you can see the Metahuman joints, and in green on top of that is the Fit Skeleton joints. And you just want to make sure and double check that everything came in on top of each other in the right places, ankles at ankle, root is at root, etc. I've never actually had it fail, but sometimes things could get misaligned depending on which Metahuman you're using. It's basic computer nonsense can sometimes happen. But if everything looks good, then you can click the next button, which is Build Advanced Skeleton. This is the thing that will actually create the rig based on the skeleton definition. Essentially what we're doing is building a skeleton which we will animate, and then we're going to have that skeleton stick to the Metahuman's actual skeleton. And that is what this third button does. So clicking that should now bind the advanced skeleton to the Metahuman's actual skeleton, and when we manipulate the rig on the advanced skeleton, it should move the Metahuman. Testing a few joints just to be sure that everything came through correctly. Looks good, deformations work. You might be tempted to click the last button, but you shouldn't. That button specifically extracts blend shapes that may exist on the mesh and then assigns controls for that blend shape next to the head. But in the case of a Metahuman, those blend shapes are not really meant for human interaction. If we click this, you can actually see there on the right, they have very unfriendly names. There's tons of them. They kind of make sense, but not really. They're not meant for you to use. Those blend shapes exist for the rig and for Unreal behind the scenes to do corrective posing, things like that. Some of these shapes are for the live link control, and they're based off the Apple Face ID. But basically, you just should not ever use those. So those blend shapes are not something you should do. So once we have our advanced skeleton built up, we're pretty much almost ready to animate, but there's still a few things that we need to set up, and primarily that's going to be facial animation poses. So I'm creating two views here, one that's orthogonal from the front, the other is my perspective. And this frontal orthogonal view is what I'm going to use to create a thumbnail for Studio Library so that I can, at a glance, see what shapes I've created. Now, something to note, if you're working off of the same file as the one you imported the Metahuman in, you can get some weird behavior with the camera orbit controls. It'll seem to rotate around, I don't know, nothing, anything, infinity. Easiest way to fix that is to simply create a new camera and set that as your perspective. It's just a weird Maya bug. So, opening up Studio Library, you can see I have presets that I've made for another Metahuman. And because Metahumans all share the same facial control board, I could technically use these exact presets on any Metahuman I create, but for the sake of the tutorial, I'll go ahead and start from scratch as if I've never had these. So, you can create a new folder by right-clicking, selecting Create New Folder, and I'll name it something that's easy to understand and remember. And this will be the folder in which I keep all of the facial poses I make for this particular rig. One of the first things I'll do is create a selection set of just the facial controls. If you've animated for a while, you're probably used to having controls being NURBS curves, but in the case of Metahumans, this is actual geometry. These are not NURBS. And it kind of makes sense, but not really. So it's a little awkward to select, but keep that in mind. They're not curves, it's actual geometry. So with my controls selected, I can right-click Create a New Pose, and I'll hit the Capture button to create a thumbnail for it. I'm using Isolate Selection to select just the geometry, and isolating that by hitting Control 1. That way I have a nice clean thumbnail that I can understand at a glance. The goal is to create 10 basic shapes, and I've just created a neutral pose with none of these controls moved, all of them in their initial positions. That way I have something to go back to. And the reason that there's 9 poses is because, according to Jonathan Cooper in his book Game Anim, you actually have 9 basic shapes for the mouth that can effectively convey anything that someone is saying with a flat, uninflected expression and tone of voice in English. And so that's what we're going to do. We're just going to create those 9 shapes and save each one as a particular pose, so that later when we do our dialogue blocking, all we have to do is identify the predominant mouth shape, the predominant consonant sound or vowel sound, apply that pose and blend it. One of the nice things about the Metahuman rig, especially in the control board for the face, is that it won't allow you to do anything that is physically impossible. So for example, you can't raise the corners of the mouth and have the middle of the upper lip still stay in position or even go down. It's physically impossible for muscles to pull in that particular way in the face, and so the rig itself doesn't allow you to do this. And that's great. Having that kind of automation is what really speeds up animation. The same thing happens with the jaw. Like when you open the mouth, the corners of the mouth pull down slightly and the cheeks relax slightly, because that's naturally what would have to happen when someone is opening their jaw. And if they open it really wide, it's basically impossible to have tight cheeks as well. So, little things like that, the fact that those considerations have been taken and implemented really make animating with Metahuman really easy. So skipping ahead, I just keep creating my poses, and eventually I have all 10. And don't worry if you've created a pose and then later on you decide, oh man, this doesn't look too great. You can always right-click on a pose and select Overwrite to basically recreate it. You can rebuild the thumbnail, you can reassign the controls it affects, anything you want. It's very self-explanatory. So jumping over to Unreal. This is an ArcVis scene that I got off the marketplace. I believe it was maybe $10, if that. This is not mandatory. You don't actually have to spend money on anything that we're doing here, but just for a few dollars you can get a fairly decent looking scene that complements the realism in your Metahuman. So that way you can animate a scene and have it take place in a space that looks naturalistic and kind of complements the character, rather than being just an empty void or a couple blocks of color, or the stereotypical gray blocks in the background of a mice. So assuming that you have a set that you want to use, you can control click all of the objects in that scene that you think your character is going to touch or interact with in some way. In this case, I'm going to have the character sitting on the couch, so I know that I'm probably going to need the floor, but I'll most definitely need the couch. And then I can go up to the File menu, and toward the bottom there's an Export Selected option. This will allow us to export the current selection as an FBX mesh. I should point out that I'm using FBX 2018 because sometimes FBX 2014 will create strange conflict and weird behavior, but 2018 is fairly stable. Anything newer than that, your mileage may vary. We don't need the level of detail, and we don't need the collision mesh. We really just want the representative mesh. Export that out, jump back into Maya, and we're ready to start setting up for our animation. We'll import the Metahuman rig, and we won't use namespaces. That's important. We want to resolve clashing nodes with the file name, but we don't want to use namespaces. And the reason for that is because the poses that we've created in Studio Library will not apply if we have a namespace, since they were created without a namespace, which is counterintuitive for animators. Typically we're used to referencing in things instead of importing them, but in this case it's okay, we can import. So your object listing in the outliner should look like this, which is exactly the same as it looked when we first imported our Metahuman. So we can open up Studio Library and double click any one of the poses we created, and they should apply. If they don't, then that means there's probably a namespace conflict, and so either the poses were created with a namespace or the character was imported with a namespace. Something like that is happening, so it can't find what it's looking for. It can't find those controls because the names are different. But assuming everything went well, you can import the FBX that we exported from Unreal, and it will appear in the exact same world space position as it did in the level. In this case, it was downstairs slightly and a little bit off from the center. So this is good, this is correct. With our set imported and our rig ready to go, our poses set up for the facial animation, we're now ready to start animating. First thing we're going to do is body animation. And before anything else, I want to get the character in position, grounded, and just basically blocked out. The camera's near clip plane is by default set to 0.1, which can create flickering and a little bit of weirdness. Just set the near plane to 1. I've never found myself needing to be closer to a surface than 1 centimeter while animating, so 0.1 seems like overkill and it just creates graphical oddities. But if you set it to 1, then everything looks fine. Just for basic housekeeping and ease of use, I've added all of the geometry of the set to its own render layer. That way I can toggle it on and off as needed and set it to reference so that I don't accidentally click it. I'm also importing the dialogue clip for the scene that I want to animate, and just making sure that the entire sequence is long enough to accommodate it. One of the things I'm about to use is a player called Keyframe MP. It's a media player, but it's specifically designed for animators, and so it doesn't drop frames. It plays every frame of a video. It allows you to step forward frame by frame. It has a host of other features, but one of the best, in my opinion, is the fact that it actually can synchronize with Maya through the use of a script that its creator provides. It's not free, but it's worth the cost, and it's a one-time purchase. So here I have my reference loaded in using Keyframe MP, and I have the script provided by the creator. And when I click sync on that script, now as I jump through the timeline, my reference file moves to that same position in time. I've set the multiplier to 2.5 because my reference video is 60 frames per second, but I'm animating in 24. And that's one of the very cool things about Keyframe MP. It just takes all of that nonsense out of the way so that I don't actually have to re-render my source video at the same frame rate as I'm animating, just so I can have reference that I can view and match up. Totally worth the one-time purchase. I'm not paid, they're not sponsoring this video, but I really believe in Keyframe MP. It's so good. So here I'm blocking out the initial pose. This part I end up spending quite a bit of time on. The first pose is always, in my opinion, the hardest pose of a shot because it's the establishing pose. Everything that follows after that is usually just going to be a natural consequence, right? Like if your character's walking into a room, they're walking from that first step, so it's just a cycle, but after that first pose is when it comes in. Or if your character is jumping, from jumping up from sitting down, you still have to get them sitting down. So you have to worry about collisions with the ground, the registration of their hands if they're leaning back, that sort of thing. It's really where the tone of the shot is set. So it's worth spending a lot of time, in my opinion, on your initial rest pose, that first frame. In this case, there's multiple points of contact between the character and the set objects, the actual couch. So it's important for the believability of the scene to make sure that the registration of the hand really sticks, to make sure that it's dialed in correctly. And so even though I'm just doing a block out and I haven't even gotten very far into the animation, this is less than a second or two in, I'm taking the time to do all of the breakdowns for the hand just to be sure that the registration works and that it fits well. I've gone way off of the reference here. In the actual video, she just kind of sits there and gestures as she speaks, which is very realistic, but it's not interesting to watch. So I felt that a weight shift was necessary to provide some animation, some interactivity, something to show that she's really alive. It would probably have been smarter and faster for me to record a reference of someone sitting up on the couch as well, but the motion itself isn't too difficult, it's just a weight shift, so I felt that I could eyeball it and get away with it. In this section, you can see me trying to do IK-FK matching manually, because I'm actually switching between IK and FK right at the point where she decides to come to rest and then gesture with her hands outward. An easy way to get around that is usually just to have an IK-FK matching script, but Metahumans don't really seem to play well with many of the scripts that I've found, so more often than not, I end up having to manually just match it and hope that the swap isn't noticeable. So one thing that I've done to try and mitigate that noticeable pop between IK and FK is to actually spread the switch out over a series of frames. And so if you watch, you'll see me actually set the IK controls 12 frames ahead of the ending position, and then I'll start the switch and allow it to gradually happen over the next 12 frames so that the FK and IK transition is the actual linear animation that you see happening. I'm not really doing any kind of breakdown for that hand with the phone moving to her lap. I'm just sort of allowing the IK-FK switch to take care of that for me. So it masks the transition. So once you have the body animation completely figured out, maybe not polished, but at least you've got it 90% of the way there, it's time to start the facial animation. Facial animation, in my opinion, is best done with animation layers. If you've never used an animation layer, Sir Wade Neistat actually has a really great introductory video on the concept of animation layers and how to use it. I'll link that in the description. But basically, I find it easiest to block in the basic dialogue on one layer of animation, and then on top of that add in all of the inflections and corrections and pushes that really sell the dialogue to add the emotion, things like that. On that additional layer, I will also include the eyes and eyebrows, the basic cheeks, all of the emotion. So basically I have two animation layers when I'm doing facial animation. I have the dialogue lip sync layer, and then I have the emotion layer. This dialogue lip sync layer is where I'm putting all of these presets. These are the poses that we created initially, those 10 basic poses, 9 shapes plus that neutral, and I'm just applying them. You don't have to apply them 100%. In fact, for the most part, applying any one of these shapes at 100% at any time isn't really the best thing, because when people speak, it's usually a combination of several shapes, and they just kind of run together. Reference is helpful, but the reference that I have for this particular shot isn't the best. She's using a webcam with a wide-angle lens, and it's positioned way above her eye line, so I'm not getting a very good look at the mouth shapes that she's making, and there's some distortion in there. It's very flattering for her, it makes her look great, but as reference, it's terrible. So I end up having to reference my own face as well. I have a mirror in front of me, and it's a good way to work, but often when we're working on dialogue as animators, we tend to overemphasize some of the things that we say, especially if you're saying the same thing over and over again and you're deliberately looking for the shape of your mouth while you say it. There's a tendency to over-exaggerate. So I find it most useful to just say it once, record myself saying the line, and then referencing that recording. So once you have your facial animation sorted, you feel pretty good about your body animation, it's time to export this out to a format that Unreal can use. If you have a prop in your scene and it's parent constrained, in this case, the phone is parent constrained to the character's hand, you have to remember that means the phone itself doesn't actually have animation keys yet. So what you've got to do is, under the animation menu set, go under Key and say Bake Simulation. And you'll want to bake the simulation onto a animation layer, and it's okay to just go ahead and bake to every frame. I don't really have the best results when I do Smart Bake, and I find that it doesn't really matter if there's a key on every single frame. That's actually pretty nice in most cases. So once you have that simulation baked, then your object actually has all the keys it needs to export out, and you can select the root bone, open up Game Exporter, and export that selected object. You only need the bone for animation. You don't need to select the geometry of the prop. And so to export out the Metahuman animation, just select the DHI body root joint, and then export selection using the Game Exporter. You'll know it's working because it'll go through and sample the entire timeline. You'll see it stepping through. But it could take a while because there are a lot of joints. And then to export out the facial animation, you don't select the joint chain, you actually select all of the facial controls. And then export that out. It's a little weird, but there's a reason for this, and we'll get to that in a second. But you export the facial controls selected as FBX. We'll jump back over to Bridge, where we need to get our Metahuman into Unreal. So go to your export settings, and this time we're going to set our export target as Unreal Engine. Make sure it's the correct version. 427 in this case. Make sure that it's going to the project where you're making your film, and then click Export. And you should see a little pop-up in the top right that says it's exporting. Tab over to Unreal, and you should see a few message boxes flashing by as different pieces of the Metahuman come in, all the different textures and things like that. There's no message box this time, making sure to click to confirm. You can just hit the button and let it go. Which is good because this process, depending on your hardware, can take a while. Once it's all imported, Unreal may ask you about importing additional files. Don't worry about any of that, but you can double check to make sure that everything came through okay by double clicking the blueprint for the new Metahuman you got. And you can take a look even at some of the meshes that make up the Metahuman. Depending on your clothing options, it'll be split up in different ways. But once your Metahuman's in, make sure that you're using the proper skeleton for it. This will be the same skeleton that came in with the Metahuman that all of the meshes are bound to. In this case, it's the Metahuman base skeleton. And then click Import on the FBX that you exported from Maya. It's a good idea to save after each import, especially because there's a lot of files that get modified when you bring in a Metahuman, and that process, it took a very long time, so it's good to not do that too often. You can double check your animations by double clicking on the imported file, but the easiest thing to do is just drag the blueprint for your Metahuman into a scene, click on the body component, and select the animation that you imported. It should line up, but because of a little vagary, because computers are precise but not accurate, you may need to adjust your character a few centimeters in world space. In this case, I think I settled on about 7 up in the Z-axis just to get it to line up correctly. For the facial animation, you'll import it in a slightly different way. So don't do that here. But we will, in this case, since I have a prop, I'll import in the phone mesh in a somewhat similar way, and then bring in the animation for it the same exact way using the phone's skeleton as the base driver. And I can double click on the imported animation to make sure that it works. But again, the easiest way to do it is just drag it into the world, assign the animation, and it should look okay. I think I end up adjusting this in world space as well, just a few units so it lines up nicely. And one of the things you may notice is that your Metahuman's hair doesn't really work out. This is an issue that will probably be resolved, but it has to do with the fact that the Metahuman creator has support for hair dyes, but the shader does not. And so you can adjust that by just fixing the hair saturation and changing it so that it's a little higher than 0. You may notice some deformation strangeness on your character, but that's not a problem. Just select the body, search for post-process blueprint, and just uncheck that. Now, if you play it in the editor to check, you may notice that the animations don't sync up perfectly, but that's because Play in Editor isn't a frame-locked representation. But it's good enough to give us some idea that everything is going to work. So now what we need to do is create a level sequence by right-clicking, going under the animation menu and selecting level sequence. Give it an appropriate name so you can find it later. Double-click it to open it up in Sequencer. And this is where we're going to sequence, hence the name, our animation, like our entire shot. So first thing we're going to do is add our Metahuman blueprint to Sequencer. And you may notice that that's going to snap her back to the world origin, but that's because it's created a control rig for the body and the face. Now the body control rig we don't really need, so we can right click and delete that. We'll keep the face one though, because we do need that. So now we can just click on our actor, add a track for the body component for animation. And we'll just select the animation that we imported in, the one we were testing earlier. And this should put the character back on the couch where we had her. And we see that it does, so we know that that's working. Now I'm going to right click on the face control rig and import into FBX. And this is where we're going to import the facial animation. When you select the file, it should have the correct frame rate, it should have the correct frame range, and so that's all good indicators. And the only thing you'll need to change is the control mapping presets. Make sure to set that to Metahuman. Click import, and that should give you a key on every frame for the duration of your sequence. If this didn't work, something went wrong with the export. Either you didn't select all the controls or something like that, so double check that. But assuming that everything went well, you should now have an animation on your body and on your face. So now all you have to do is import any animation that's on your props. By adding it to Sequencer and then adding the animation. Same thing that we did with the character. If we press play, we can see that it's all frame locked, synchronized, working correctly. So now we're going to click on the camera icon on the upper left of the Sequencer tab, and that's just a shortcut to create a cinematic camera, create a shot, assign that camera, just a bunch of like little tedious weird things get handled for you automatically, so it's a good way to create a shot. And that camera object I'm now going to manipulate to create the movement that we had originally in Maya. But the first thing I'm going to do before I started really adjusting things is just fix the focal distance. You can click on the Show Debug Focus Plane, and that will allow you to see exactly where the camera is focused. Because it's very hard to direct the camera where everything is out of focus. So now you can switch your view using the menu in the upper left of the viewport there. And I've unlocked it from the camera cut by clicking the camera icon, the small camera icon near the plus in Sequencer. And then basically when I change my viewport to the camera, I can now fly it around the same way that I would in Maya. The only difference is that it's WASD instead of Alt and mouse. And I'm just using that to find good framing, and then I'm hitting that small gray plus button on the transform track in sequencer to keyframe that position. So whatever the current position of my camera is, I hit that small gray plus button and that creates a keyframe of that position at that point in time. You can kind of think of it like the timeline in Maya. I can hit the eject button and swap back to the view within the shot by clicking that camera icon, and so now I'll see the shot framed exactly as I've keyed it with the correct aspect ratio, correct margins, all of that. And I can just kind of scrub through the sequence to see that, okay, the shot's moving, framing is pretty good, but I'm being picky at this point, and I'm just sort of noticing that the shot moves a little too early and it stops too late. So you can drag keyframes around to change the timing and spacing without having to rekey. I'm also adding a keyframe to the first and last frames, and this is just a good practice for anything that you key in sequencer, because that'll prevent the curves from getting a little bit weird. Almost any object property can actually be keyframed in sequencer. So in this case, I'm also going to keyframe the focus, because as the camera moves and as the subject moves, the focal plane needs to adjust to keep the subject in focus and nice and sharp. I'll also keyframe the aperture settings, even though I'm not going to change those. It's a good idea to at the very least set an initial and ending key for anything, any value, so that way nothing can accidentally be set to the wrong thing. Because if you don't key it, it'll just be whatever it is at the time that the sequencer starts recording. So it's best to have a key than to not have a key. Sequencer will only output rendered frames. It won't actually create a finished video. You have to do that in another program. But what you can do is bring in audio just to double check and make sure that everything is sequenced correctly to the audio keys that you have. And you can do that by importing the wave that you use to animate in Maya. The same file can come in as it is, as a wave file, and you can add it to sequencer. And then that's just an easy way to check and make sure that everything still times out to exactly where it needs to be. Your mouth shapes match, all that good stuff. Because it is possible that when importing an animation, maybe you have the frame rate set incorrectly. There is a multiplier for the speed of animations, and so this is just a good way to do a sanity check. So here I've added some cinematic lighting, but the most important thing that I've done is added 48 frames to the start of the camera cut by dragging it to the left. So the shot actually starts at -48, it still ends at the same place, but those extra 2 seconds will give the physics in the engine time to like relax and get to where it is, because it's just like it's a video game engine at the end of the day. And so the physics are going to kind of be a little crazy when things spawn in, but 2 seconds should be enough time for everything to settle down. So we're going to render things out in the movie render queue, and that's actually controlled by a plugin. So if you go up to the plugins menu and search for movie render queue, you can find it, and by default it's not enabled, so you can enable it by clicking the checkbox. This will prompt you to restart Unreal, and then you'll get dropped back to where you are. And to see the movie render queue tab, you go under Window, Cinematics, and select movie render queue. That'll bring you to here. And then we just add the sequence that we want to render. In this case, it's this sequence, the level sequence that we saved. And you'll have 2 options here. You'll have settings and output. Output is actually controlled by the settings, so you don't need to change it there. But we'll go into the settings, and there's a few different settings nodes that you can add in. With the output, I recommend creating a subfolder because everything's going to go under saved movie renders, and it can get a little messy if you have multiple shots. So it's always good to specify a name so that you have a subdirectory and keep all of your frames gathered in the same place. So like I mentioned, there's a lot of settings, so I'll create a previous configuration, and these are the settings that at minimum you would need for a high quality render. Bitmap sequence, deferred rendering, anti-aliasing settings, and we are using temporal AA, which can make things a little blurry, but it's the fastest way to render. And there's a way to get around the blurriness that comes with that. These console variables, just use them. There's not nearly enough time to explain what each one does or why, but this is a good starting point, so just copy these values. And then for the output, the important thing to point out here is the frame size. I intend to make a 1080 video, but you can see that I'm rendering out at 4K, and that's because we're going to squeeze down the size to half of what was rendered to bring back some of the sharpness that temporal AA will lose. So once you've got all your settings set up, click render, and depending on your hardware, this could be very fast or very slow. It was very slow for me. But eventually you'll have an image sequence of all of your rendered frames, and you can import that into whatever you want to create a video. After Effects, DaVinci, you can even do it in Blender, I'm told. But the important thing is to make sure that your frame rate is set to what it was in Sequencer, in this case 24. You can then add your audio track and render it out to a video format. And you're not quite done yet, although you could call it at that point. But what I'd like to do is take that first pass and bring it in as a reference and jump back into Maya for final adjustments to the animation. That's because that rendered video is your first chance to really see what your animation looks like in context, with the lighting, with the lens, with the depth of field settings, with everything applied. And often that's very different than what you saw in Maya. And so it's important to go back and double check your work and make sure that things came out the way that you imagined they would when you were animating in Maya. In my case, they didn't for every mouth shape. Subsurface scattering and the position of the lights kind of affected the silhouette. The shadows changed things a little bit. So some of her mouth shapes didn't quite read the way they should. They didn't really look like the sound they were supposed to make. And so I'm going back through, I'm spotting those points, and I'm adjusting. I'm really pushing those shapes to make up for the difference. And after you've readjusted your animation, of course, you just follow the same sequences that we did earlier to export out the animation and re-import it. This is an optional step, but I highly recommend it because it can make the difference. And that's it. You're done. Congratulations, you finished your first Metahuman animation.
Hey, can I smash? these comments never make sense to me. It's like, what are you going to do? Shove your dick through the computer screen? How is that going to work? Like, are you going to fly me out? Are you going to fly me to wherever it is you live? Are you going to drive over here? Like, how does that even work? I don't understand why people say that.